Hi, this is Justin. Welcome to the Psychic Unconscious Roots of Poetry. I wanted to go a little bit deeper today. You know, last week we talked about the Mother Goddess and how it's very simple to see, at least in Jungian terms, is that she's an outgrowth of the first mother. And as I explained, that even though that the male was undoubtedly stronger, as they always are, that if the first human was a male, in our little case where we had the two animals. All right. Get a little carried away there in one of my monitor sets, so let's just see if we can. We just get rid of that. So that's what happens when you're broadcasting, is that your goddamn technology eventually just overwhelms you. But anyway, we're not afraid of it. We're using it. We can use the pen as well as the cathode ray tube and the logic circuit. You know, it's all a way of just getting the communication out. And I think that artists should be, as they are today, are getting more and more in line with that kind of thinking. Excuse me. Anyway, as I was saying, that in terms of it's very simple to see how, in fact, if the first human was a male in our little scenario of there's nobody in the world except those two animals who somehow, God knows how this happens, give birth to a human animal. With the human animal being an animal, the same animal, not smarter, not more emotional, not more this or that, but can create stories. It's the real Big Bang, by the way, because out of that comes everything. Philosophy, history, E equals MC squared, it all comes out of our ability to fashion stories and to communicate complex things to one another. It doesn't even take language, by the way. You can tell more complex stories if you have language, but doesn't, you know, you can go into New Guinea today and you got a nice conversation with a pigeon, which has a vocabulary of about 400 words as opposed to the 20,000 that most people, the 40,000 most people have in their heads. And it's perfectly fine, because a lot of it is done with gesture and, you know, the intent of the story. But let's say that whether you have a small vocabulary or whether you have a huge vocabulary, the fact of the matter is when you can tell stories, the world changes. The male probably doesn't have any nurturing. It just goes on and just keeps procreating and just keeps procreating, so that the one who would most assure that the human race survived would be the female, because she would nurture humanness. She would recognize it and nurture it. And I went through all that. I think it's pretty simple to say that when the first human female eventually gave birth to the first human baby, there would be a connection immediately, an immediate connection that would be instantaneous. Because you can think of that first mother as telling stories, very simple stories. I'm sad I cried all day. You can do it with gestures and animal sounds, you know, to her mother and father, right? Who were the only two animals around until she probably mated with her father and gave birth to some babies, and one of them was a human baby, because you can't tell at that stage what's going to pop out of the oven, right? But she's just telling these stories, and nobody's listening. They're listening, but they're not getting it, because they don't get stories, animals. They don't get it. But when she gave birth to the first human offspring, if I can use it with my own name being Spring, as you can see in the corner up there somewhere, what happened is there's immediate connection. It's like, wow. The baby gets it. Don't forget that in that first female mother doesn't know what stories is, doesn't know what language is, doesn't know anything. It just knows that it's trying to communicate, and these things keep coming out of her mouth. That makes sense to her inside, because all stories are expressions of feelings. Even E equals MC squared is an expression of a feeling. It's the feeling of truth, logical truth, you know. But all stories are meant to convey feelings. King Lear, Dickens, it's a feeling. Very complex about the tragic sense of life, but whatever it is, that's what it's there for, you know. The words are just the spear carriers, you know. The real opera is the feeling. It holds that mirror up to life, as Shakespeare said. And that mirror has a lot of depth to it. And we recognize ourselves in that and what it means to be human. And we become fully human for an instant in that recognition, you know. We're no longer shallow Sam, you know, worried about the pence and the pounds. We begin to see ourselves in a whole new light, which is a very mysterious light, by the way. To know yourself more and more is to become more mysterious. It's only when you're stupid you don't really know yourself, as you think you're so sure and, oh yeah, I know what I am, but you have no idea. And you have no idea where you're going and no idea why you did what you did in the past. You think you do. You made up stories about it, but God knows you have no idea. And you don't have the slightest idea what you're going to do 10 seconds from now. You think you do. But you don't. You can set up a target and try to live up to it, but at some stage something happens. You can't control you can't control fates. Fates are always outside weaving. You might have set up a little scenario for yourself, but it doesn't work, baby. You're going to get caught eventually, or unless you're going to go hide in a dark room somewhere and not do anything. Just count from 1 to 10 for the rest of your life. Have some people slip food to you, you know. Then you might have a pretty good idea of your life, but if you're living a life fully as a human being, you have no idea what's going to happen to you. Anyway, it's easy to see how that first mother became the creator. I created you. That would be the first story she would tell the child. You exist because of me. I'm going to tell you what to do. Mother, 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 mother. Okay, listening carefully, making sure that this baby is human and not the animal. She'll take care of the animal baby, but she really wants to take care of the human because she's lonely. She needs somebody to listen and talk back. That's what it means to be human. You got it, you know, 2 ways. So she's listening. She wants to talk. She wants to communicate. She wants the child to talk back, you know. That can get multiplied hundreds and hundreds of times and thousands of times until you get the human race, you know. But the important thing is that they want to communicate, and she values that. So when the time comes to mate again, and she looks back at her little family, there's a father and a mother, her animals. Maybe she gave birth to a son. He's now about 12 years old, you know. She still has a procreative life. What would you mate with? You mate for your other half, as Plato says, and your other half is another human. Not the dad that you had to go to because that was the only one around, and he came to you basically, so, you know, he's kind of sniffing around, you know, and so that's your first mating as a female. So that you have the first mother as creator, birth giver, teacher, enchantress, whatever you want to call it, right? It's a pretty powerful blend. And you can see that getting larger and larger as the stories are passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation, and it gets bigger and bigger and it gets internalized. You know, the thing we found about oral transmission is extremely accurate about the basic themes. But in terms of measurement and things like that, there always tend to be exaggerations as time goes on. So that, for example, in the Iliad, maybe in the initial tellings of that story, way before Homer, because Homer was one of the last ones to tell that story, right? He had heard it as a child and wanted to tell his own version of it, maybe back 800, 900 years, because that was the time between the Trojan War and Homer appearing on the scene as a baby. Maybe the little Trojan horse was a little horse they left outside, a little thing, you know, that big, whatever. And over time, the horse developed, got bigger. The guys inside it, you just go, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what happens. Tall tales. But in terms of the basic themes of the mother as the creatress, as the educator, as the teacher, as the procreator, as the fornicator, love maker, whatever you want to call it, that became bigger. That image became bigger and became internalized. And over generations, that's what happens. It becomes a God figure, the all-knowing. It's just a natural thing that happens, Just a natural thing that happens. Because everybody agrees on that, It's not just the first mother yakking away. The mothers that she gave birth to would also be, yeah. From her we came, That's the common theme. So you can see why the men didn't have an interesting story like that to tell because they didn't nurture the humanness. It's the mothers were doing it constantly and constantly, and that first mother was doing it so that baby that she brought up and brought the humanness out would bring it out in her children, Again, because you can't become human unless you're speaking and listening, speaking and listening, speaking and listening, speaking and listening, and that's what it is. So you can see that mother would have attributes of she was powerful, making sure that the baby she gave birth to was human, start to talk to the baby, would want eventually to mate with that child as it came up. That was the thing to do, would protect that child if it was attacked. If they were attacked, she would protect that child first. That's close. That's her. The other one is something that happened, but it's not her. So you can see that it goes. And then you have a situation, since I'm very big on menstrual cycles, and I will tell you why in a second. But one of the things that you have to understand is that for some reason, and in fact I don't know what the background is, and I doubt that anybody can tell you what the background is, but if you look at the other primates, their menstrual cycle is not 28 days. It's not a moon cycle. Just the human animal has the 28-day lunar cycle. And amongst primates, if I get this correct, I just found this out today, as a matter of fact, I was just kind of looking at some research, is that the human animal is the only one that bleeds during menstruation. To bleed is to die. So here you have a human mother, much different than the other animal mothers, who is ovulating and bleeding. That is the fact the female senses something is happening inside her, right? She wants to give birth. She wants to procreate. She wants to copulate. I get the right word eventually. It's the time for her to do it. And at that peak of ovulation, and then as it dies, like in the fall seasons, and everything dies, then she bleeds and things like that. That's hooked up to the lunar cycle. So you don't think that didn't produce stories, did you? The human mother herself would be astounded once she could step back and she could formulate a story about that, no matter how crude. I am the moon. I come from nothing, and I blossom, and then I die. Just like the moon does. Pretty powerful stories to be repeated and repeated and repeated. So when you finally get to somebody like Robert Graves, who's working from different sources than my Einsteinian theories, but it all comes down to the same thing. He was himself and I'm me, and he was really the one who really made the breakthroughs. I'm adding little footnotes to it. Here's what Graves says. It's the bottom thing. I hope you can read it, but I'm going to read it to you. Of the mother goddess, which what he calls the white goddess or muse. He calls the white goddess the muse, basically, is they're kind of used interchangeably, but it's an aspect of the mother goddess, the muse, and I'll go into that in a second. He just says that's what it is, that the mother goddess is the muse, take it or leave it. And I didn't know how to take it at first, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt my way through it. He's correct. Anyway, Here's a mother goddess, so you can see how powerful she was and how she fit into every aspect of that world that these new humans were becoming aware of. As goddess of the underworld, she was concerned with birth, procreation, and death. As goddess of the earth, she was concerned with the 3 seasons of spring, summer, and winter. She animated trees and plants and ruled all living creatures. Ruled all living creatures. As goddess of the sky, she was the moon in her 3 phases of new moon, full moon ovulation, and waning moon bleeding. But I'm putting my own words in here, please allow me. But it must never be forgotten that the triple goddess was a personification of primitive woman, woman the creatress and destructress. As the new moon or spring, she was girl, young. As the full moon or summer, she was woman. As the old moon or winter, she was hag. Basically, you had a goddess who was hooked into the heavens. In a way, the men had no. The men, forget the men. They weren't hooked into anything. That was the problem. It's always been the problem. They're not hooked into anything. That the human animal is the only animal that's always in heat. And that's what, in fact, everyone will tell you about males. Those dogs. But that's true. So they have no rhythm. But basically, all the time. But in terms of the woman in fact, she has a rhythm that's hooked to the moon, that's hooked to birth, that's hooked to death. The whole menstrual cycle, she's everything. She's the mother, she's the lover, she's the teacher, she's the governor of the seasons, the sun and the moon. It's such a fit that the men never even got up to first to the plate. They never got up to the plate. They were back. They were just sitting on the bench. It was a bang, and that was reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. Now, that I think, when you go back to just take a look at it in a very kind of Einsteinian sense, those little kind of dramas, you can see how Graves is correct. How does she become the muse? Well, she becomes the muse in a sense because that the first mother was the storyteller. She's the first storyteller. She told you the first stories. Well, how does that get to be the muse when that just kind of comes to you? Well, to kind of move to that end of the picture, we have to move back to Julian Jaynes. You've kind of been talking a little bit in the language of Carl Jung, and that the unconscious, which I have first told you, which I think, and I don't care what anybody says about it, but in fact I think was our animal consciousness, if you will, became our unconscious and was attached to us and would not let go. It's our feeling self, basically, which is what our animal consciousness was. It was very smart. Didn't have any sense of time and space like our conscious mind has, because our conscious mind is telling stories. It always knows the beginning and ends. Human animal is much different than the animal, okay? But that unconsciousness starts to grow. That's one of the things that Jung made us aware of. And he says that the Bible is a record of the unconscious mind becoming more human. Or you can say it another way, of God becoming more human. From becoming completely unreasonable God of Abraham to the Jesus. With Job being a pivotal point where when Job recognizes that you can't depend on God for anything, it's wisdom. Job reaches a moment of wisdom, of human wisdom, that no matter how good a life I lead and how good a life my children lead, there is no predicting what God will do. God is unreasonable. I have to accept that. That's a monumental step in human development. I'm not going to argue anymore. That's just the way it is. And what Jung says is that God was outdone. He was outshone. And he had to one-up. And to one-up, the only thing he could become is more human. And from Job on is a story of a more human God, which eventually culminates in Jesus. So the unconscious is not our unconsciousness, is not the animal unconsciousness that we separated from some 100,000 or 40,000 years ago, depending on what date you want to use, whenever it happened. it's become more human with time, but it doesn't have any time and space. It's not a physical. It doesn't live in a physical world. It lives in a non-physical world, and where it resides, your guess is as good as mine. You can say it's the body, but we know it reaches beyond the body in some of the things that it knows, and in some of its patterns of behavior, whatever you want to call them, that Jung had uncovered. You know, that in fact all human beings, somewhere in the recesses of their unconscious, is the race memory, or the human race memory of the mother, and that becomes what he calls the mother archetype. That it's like Plato's ideal form of the mother that lets us know what a mother is, what love is, what honor is, all those things that you think you can put your finger on, as Socrates proved, being the sly pitch man for Plato, is you don't know nothing, baby. I'm going to flip you over and you're not going to know anything until you have to admit that you don't know shit. And the only way you can approach it, what Plato was trying to say to us in story form, is that you have to accept that somehow inside us is we know what is true and what is beautiful. It's an ideal form. It's something that's human within us. Jung comes to the same conclusion. He just says that, for example, if in terms of what he calls in terms of the mother archetype becomes inflamed, he has a different word for it, but it gets out of control, that it begins to in fact distort all of our normal human views as a person of our mothers. Just grows out. It just melds in with our own personal memory. So in some sense, we have access to things that we didn't think that come up and can put us in great danger. You know, we can be possessed by archetypes of killers, if you want, whatever it happens to be. You know, and we live a life of just being in complete danger. We can't function anymore. We're just scared to death, you know. It has nothing to do with our personal memories. We perhaps have lived a very golden little life on a golden pond, but one of those gets loose for some reason, and we're in really deep yogurt. That's why it's so hard to control real mental illness when it gets to that stage, you know, because what's happening is that it's somehow from our unconscious has decided, or it's just grown out of proportion, and it's kind of melded with our conscious memories, or whatever you want to call them, of danger or of the mother or whatever, and then we're in real trouble, you know. So, yet we have to, but I think we can take Jung, we can see that what happens is that the unconscious starts to absorb all of those conscious realizations of the mother, all of those stories, the feelings of the stories, not the stories. It doesn't remember stories, it remembers the feelings of the stories. It's a much different intelligence. You have to kind of think about it for a while. Only humans know stories, only humans know words, only human can make, that's why we're so powerful. But the unconscious has the feelings of those stories fed back to it, you know, so to speak, you know, by our stories, and it enlarges itself, so it's always keeping pace with us in some kind of weird, strange way, you know, that we can never really figure out, but it's always doing it on its own terms. But if we go to James for a second, and we remember what he's saying about pre-literate men heard voices which they took to be the gods, because they had no other choice, and I believe that those first voices were female voices, whatever those were. They weren't like sweetie voices, you know. This mother goddess, if you take the very first stages, was a real act to follow. But they were the female voices, and that somehow had become internalized. And as James, I think it pretty accurately proves, is that we had language capability in the right lobes of our brains, and somehow that the unconscious, whoever that happens to be, that had begun to develop feelings of the mother goddess and all the rest of it, started to emerge, and we started to hear those voices that poets hear today, and that some small percentage of people here today as guiding voices. At one time, all human beings heard them, and they reacted to them, and they did what the voices told them. And as time progressed, as we became closer and closer to literacy, and even afterwards, we didn't hear those voices anymore. We would go to the oracles, the prophets, who were always female at that stage. That makes some sense, doesn't it? And they would deliver rhythmic, metaphoric messages. It was up to you to figure them out. But they would, and they paid attention. People in the pre-scientific times, they paid attention to those omens and those auguries and those oracles, you know, because they had been proven to be correct time and time and time again. That's why you have to say that the unconscious has an intelligence that we can't even begin to fathom. It's there. We just have to be able to interpret it and know it has its limitations, because it's not pinpoint accurate, you know. It could mean many things. That's why people who can interpret dreams and who can interpret oracles were worth their weight in gold to the ancients. They somehow had a knack for it, of not misinterpreting them. But if we can think of that for a while, of our human beings as they dawdle along, hundreds of generations later, they're hearing the voices when they come to novel situations, and they learn to take those, and that's what they're supposed to do. The voices have always been good to them, but they understand them. They're guiding voices. They're internalization of the Mother Goddess. At some stage, you can see them wanting to tell stories back to the voices, to the gods, to the unknowable. And they would tell stories back. And how would they tell them? They would tell them in the same way that they heard them. They would be rhythmic. If you're going to speak to the gods, you don't do it like you're in Brooklyn. You got to do it like the gods speak to you, the rhythmic voices. And I think that they were also capable of just getting to the edge of things, where in the beginning you can say that almost all language that we used were metaphors. Emerson says that language is fossilized poetry, because what's happening is, in order to express ourselves at a very early stage, we had no words, we had no language, we had just sounds, and we had our gestures, our mime, you know, kiss you, what are those things, you know. So you could string those together into a story, you know, that happened to be just as best you could, and that story would in itself be metaphoric. It just happened naturally because you didn't have enough words, and that's how it went. But or it was close to metaphor, you know. What happened then, I believe, is what happened is that the unconscious, again, in the kind of Jungian terms, it modified itself. So some part of it became the muse, which is not a guiding voice. Do this. But this is what you must do, you know, that kind of stuff. They were storytelling voices. They were another aspect of the Mother Goddess, who was a guide, but also was a storyteller. Hey, listen, you know, before me, there wasn't anything. Not even you. It wasn't even me. Then I came along. Me. And if I didn't come along, you wouldn't be here. So you have those stories. They're starting the stories, you know. Those stories, again, when they came from the first humans, were always rough. They're always metaphoric, as you are. If you want to get some idea as to how metaphoric your speech can be, go to a foreign country where you know maybe 30 or 40 words, and you get stranded, and you have to make people understand you. My mother has a story she never got over about my uncle, who was a priest, and he, of course, had to, at a certain stage, he was a Jesuit, had to speak in Latin for their meals and everything. And he wanted some ketchup. So he said in Latin, you know, give me some blood. It's a metaphor. But if you ever get stuck in a foreign country with a very limited vocabulary, you automatically speak in metaphors. You have to make approximations, you know, of things. That's why it's so interesting to hear people speak who have very little language capability in your language if they're imaginative. Because between their gestures and between the way that they happen to use the language, they can get funny, but in fact they can also get beautiful. You know, the way they express things. They're making metaphors. Okay? But what happened, I think, eventually is that some part of the guiding voices became, which is an aspect of the mother, don't do that, do this, that kind of stuff, started to come back as the humans just praise the gods in their way, trying to be rhythmic and all like that. Some part of that became internalized. And it's a very gray area as to how that actually occurred. But what happens is that at some stage, besides the guiding voices, you hear the voices of poetry, the muse, which everybody recognized instinctively as different. Guides, muse. Guides, muse. Nobody's ever mistaken the two voices who has heard them. I for sure haven't. One is a helpful voice in terms of a guide or in terms of direction. The other is an engaging storytelling voice that's going to refashion a world for you. It's going to bring up a world for you to attach yourself to in the form of a story, which it's making with you, which is called a poem. And then the unconscious gets to feel that poem back with your little taste of time and space on it, So we get into that rhythm. So you have both rhythms. You have the rhythm of the guiding voice, and then you have that little later. I think it came as a later voice, as a matter of fact. That's my own intuition on it. That first came the guiding voices, and then a little later came the internalization of the storytelling voices. Not much later. But they are a different kind of voice to feel. That the muse's voice is more human. And why wouldn't it be more human? Because it was developed out of human beings praising the gods in those first stories. Voices, we are speaking to you, we love you, God knows what they were saying, They were in awe, basically, of what was taking place, and they wanted to speak back. And as soon as they spoke back, the unconscious started to develop that and came out again. It wants to play ball. That's my famous thing about the unconscious. It wants to play ball. It's like a dog. It wants you to play with it, and then really divine things happen. Okay, so now you see we have a muse. We have our guiding voices. We've hooked up Robert Graves to our friend Julian Jaynes, and we have our pre-literate man being guided by the voices. Doesn't really need the oracles at this stage. They came much later when we stopped hearing voices, so we had to go to specialists. We learned to read and write. But and then of course was the constant voice of the muse, which was always there and has continued to. Even though all of our other voices have tended to disappear, poetry is a much more frequent voice, I believe, than the guiding voices. Just to count the number of kids you see in a class who suddenly say, "I had a poem come to me." If the people who hear your guiding voices as adults is 2%, I can guarantee you that the number of kids that poems come to them, that in which they hear voices or in which it just overtakes them and it's like a voice and it just comes out and they write it or they speak it, it's much, much higher. So for some reason that's endured. Has it endured like it was at one time when everybody got poetry and everybody understood it because they understood that it was a message from the gods and you just took it into you like rain. You didn't examine it like a document to see if there were some errors. Unbelievable. Like a contract. The thing I always really liked about the story of Moses is Moses didn't want God's promises anymore. He wanted it in writing. Get it in writing. Something I can show the guys down in the valley, because they're out of control. They're putting up these images of the cows. The constant arguing, the Hebrews, they want it in writing. They want a contract, They don't want to hear these stories anymore, they're coming through, they don't want those stories, they want to get that. We want something in writing. We can get it down so, we can get you. Next time you come around, reasonable, we're going to show it to you. This is what you said, So that's the Hebrews were astounding for their effrontery. As you can say, the Greeks never, they would dare the gods, but the Hebrews were just unbelievable. They would argue with it, the Greeks, but they never demand that the gods put it in writing. Hebrews, put it in writing. Want to see it? We're going to show it to you next time. This is what you said. 59 cents. Bananas. So it's an amazing jump, of all of the pre-literate people to become literate and to take God by the horns. It's an amazing story. And that's what we, and in terms of the Greek tradition together, they gave us what we have today, which is completely out of control, self-interested scientific thinking. It's paradise, isn't it? Oh, God. Unbelievable. All right, I'm going to leave you with a little poem that will make you happy. It's by Adora. It's a nice little poem. I'm just going to close out, and it features all women. There's women in a glass tank. It's really beautiful photography by Jean Germain, so that we turned into a video, and I forget who in fact the music is by, but I think it's by one of the Mexican singers that I recorded down in Mexico. Little girl's a hairdresser, lived next to me. What a voice, unbelievable. Here you go.
Si la noche de anoche volverá y yo me sintiera en tus brazos otra vez.
Feel the sadness
Tantas cosas
in her voice. And the voice that makes the sadness beautiful. We've cried together like women do. As women have always done. We show our feelings because there's no need to hide. Watch the way we care for each other. Feel the way we feel. Men are for laughs. The good times. But women are for crying, for sharing the pain until it becomes beautiful.